All right, welcome to the explanation of the Unit 5 practice free response questions. Um, at, so I'm going to do the AP one first and then do the regular one. That way I only have to make the one video. So just fast forward to the regular one if that's the one that you're more interested in. Anyway, we'll start with the AP one. It says, assume the nation's marginal savings rate changes from 25 to 20%. Show how that change in savings will affect the real interest rate in the loanable funds market. So what I'm hoping y'all see from this is that when it says marginal savings rate, that is talking about the MPS. So the MPS goes from 0.25 to 0.20. Okay, so that's going to be important because later on we're going to use that to calculate both our spending and our tax multipliers. All right, but this first question is really asking us how is that going to affect the real interest rate in the loanable funds market. So I'm going to draw my loanable funds market graph with all my proper labels. Got a supply of loanable funds. I've got the demand for loanable funds. All right, I titled the graph so you can see it's a loanable funds market. The y-axis is labeled as real interest rate, and the x-axis is labeled as quantity of loanable funds. All right, so this first supply curve, that is when the marginal savings rate is 0.25. So if it drops from 0.25 to 0.20, that means there's going to be less savings. So we would shift the supply curve to the left. Now, how did that affect the real interest rate? We went from R1 to R2, so the real interest rate has increased. And so that is the answer to number 1. All right, number 2. So based on our change in interest rates, how are each of the following affected? So it says investment of real capital. Well, hopefully y'all remember that when businesses purchase capital, they are either borrowing money to buy the capital or they're foregoing earning interest on cash in order to buy the capital. So either way, the interest rate affects the profitability of that capital. So when the interest rate rises, there's going to be less profitability in capital, and so investment in real capital will decrease. So remember, higher interest rates always lead to less investment. Okay? And then part B, the demand for the dollar in the foreign exchange market. So now we have to look at this from the perspective of a foreign financial investor. Okay, so if interest rates in the U.S. are rising, that means our bond prices are probably going down to demonstrate the higher interest rate on those bonds. And so if a foreigner wants to put their financial resources into our country and earn our higher interest rates, they're going to have to increase their demand for the U.S. dollar. Okay, so part B was a little bit of review from Unit 2. So hopefully you remember all that. All right, part 3. Assume that before the savings rate changed, the economy was operating at its long-run equilibrium. Using an ADAS graph, demonstrate the state of the economy prior to the changes that occurred. Mark the long-run equilibrium as point A. All right, so ADAS graph, got price level on the y-axis, real GDP is on the x-axis. I'm going to put my long-run aggregate supply curve because that's our indication of full employment output. And I've got my short-run aggregate supply curve, and I got my aggregate demand curve, and all three curves intersect at the same point, and we'll call that point A. So far, so good. All right, part A of number 3. Show the effects of the changes in investment and the value of the dollar from part 2 on the economy. So let me go back to that part 2 about the dollar. So there's going to be an increase in demand for the dollar, which means the dollar will appreciate. And when the dollar appreciates, U.S. exports will decrease. Okay. It didn't ask me about exports in number 2, part B, but I want y'all to make note of that because the aggregate demand curve is going to shift left, not just because there's less investment, but also because there's going to be fewer exports. Okay, so here's our new equilibrium. All right, point B, so we've done that. Part B, does the equilibrium at point B indicate a recessionary or inflationary gap? So, because our output decreased from our full employment equilibrium, we would call that a recessionary gap. Okay. And when there is less output, there will be a higher unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate will increase. Don't need as many workers if you're producing less output. All right, so that's page 1. Number 4, assume the Congress and President work toward a fiscal policy solution to close the gap identified in Part 3B. The gap is $500 of output. What specific policy action might they propose? So you'll remember in a recession, we're going to use expansionary fiscal policy, which is going to be either increase government spending or reduce taxes. Those are the two things that can be done during a recession. Now, given the new marginal savings rate identified in Part 1, how large should the fiscal policy action identified in Part 4A be? So, a couple things of note here. So we were given the size of the gap. So we want our change in real GDP to be $500. Okay. We were given an MPS at the beginning of 0.2. And when the MPS is 0.2, that means the expenditure multiplier is going to be 5. Okay. And then if we're looking at the tax side of it, the tax multiplier would be 4. All right, so this is a review, so I want to make sure y'all are clear. The reason the expenditure multiplier is 5 is because you calculate it by taking 1 and dividing by MPS. The reason the tax multiplier is 4 is because you take the expenditure multiplier and subtract 1. So that is why those numbers are what they are. Now, if we go back over here and I remind you of the Walden Rule times the change in government spending, or your change in real GDP is equal to the tax multiplier times the change in taxes. All right, so we want GDP to change by 500. Okay, so in both instances, we want GDP to change by 500. If we're going to use government spending, we're going to use the expenditure multiplier, which is 5. Okay. So we're going to do 5 times what level of spending equals 500? Well, algebra tells us that it's $100. So if we want to increase government spending to fix this recession, we're going to spend $100. If instead we want to use tax cuts, then we're going to cut taxes by $125 because 125 times 4 will equal the $500 gap. Okay? So basically, if we were to do all that, okay, if we did all that, then the aggregate demand curve should shift back to the right, which would increase output, which would also increase employment, which would lower unemployment. So let's look at this. The policy action identified in Part 4 will do these things. It will increase output because aggregate demand will shift to the right. Because aggregate demand shifts to the right, it will also increase the price level. And it will increase the employment in the economy because you need more workers to produce more output. Now, last thing. Okay, almost the last thing. Number 6. Assume the policy action from Part 4 requires the government to change its level of borrowing. Show in a new loanable funds market graph how that policy might affect the real interest rate. Okay? So again, if I'm drawing the loanable funds market, okay, here's our current interest rate. If the government needs to borrow more money in order to spend more or cut our taxes, then there's going to be an increase in demand for loanable funds, which is going to raise interest rates. Okay? And when the interest rates rise, it is now more expensive to borrow money for investment purposes, or it is more expensive for me to borrow money for a new car or a new house. And so that will result in crowding out. So remember, crowding out is when government borrowing reduces private spending. Okay? And so when we shift aggregate demand to the right as a result of expansionary fiscal policy, it's very possible that it doesn't move as far to the right as we thought, because crowding out is going to reduce investment spending, it's going to reduce consumption spending, assuming it's interest rate sensitive, and because the higher interest rate appreciates the dollar, it can also decrease our net exports. Okay? So that was the AP version. Let's go look at the regular one now. So let me pop that open here. All right, here is the regular economics fiscal policy practice free response. All right, it's very similar, probably a little less involved, but very similar to the other one. So number one, it says assume the U.S. economy is operating at its long-run equilibrium. Again, this is the regular version of the practice free response for Unit 5. Okay. It's, again, we're at our long-run equilibrium. Using an ADAS graph, demonstrate the current state of the economy. Mark the long-run equilibrium as point A. So I've got my graph first. Has to have all the right labels. Okay. AD. And point A is right where all three curves intersect, and everything's perfect. Number two, now assume that consumer pessimism affects the economy. So consumers, if they're worried about the future, they're probably not going to go buy new cars and houses and appliances and stereos and all kinds of cool stuff. So aggregate demand would end up shifting to the left. Okay. Remember, the reason for this is because aggregate demand is made up of consumption spending, investment spending, government purchases, and net exports. So if consumers are pessimistic and spend less, aggregate demand will drop. Okay? And so that gives us a new short-run equilibrium at point B. Okay? At point B, because there's less output, we have what's called a recessionary gap. Okay? Now, Congress and the President are going to work toward a fiscal policy solution to close that gap. The gap is $500 of output. All right, and it says that in Part B, it says that we have an MPS of 0.2. Okay, so if the Congress and President want to fix this using fiscal policy, they are either going to increase government spending or they are going to reduce taxes. Okay, so how large should that be? So let's remind ourselves of these things. We want GDP to increase. Our change in real GDP, we want it to be $500. Okay, that's because our gap is 500. We have an MPS of 0.2 that we were given. That means our expenditure multiplier is 5, and our tax multiplier is 4. So why is the expenditure multiplier 5? It is always 1 over MPS. And then why is our tax multiplier 4? Because it is always 1 less than the expenditure multiplier. So really, to close the gap, that means that we're going to use our Walden Rule, which says that our change in real GDP will be equal to our change in government spending times our expenditure multiplier, or our change in real GDP will be equal to our change in taxes times our tax multiplier. Just remember, if you want GDP to go up, though, you need taxes to go down. So our gap is 500, so we want $500 to be our change in real GDP in both situations. Our expenditure multiplier was 5, our tax multiplier was 4. So at this point, it's just algebra. 5 times what equals 500? Well, $100. So if we want to fix this, we would increase government spending by $100. That'll multiply 5 times to close a $500 gap. Or we will change taxes by $125, meaning we reduce taxes by $125. That would multiply by 4 times and change GDP by 500. So what would all that do? That would increase our output because aggregate demand would shift to the right. That would also increase our price level, and it would increase the employment in the economy. All right? Now, that's not all, though. Number 6, assume the policy action from Part 4 requires the government to change its level of borrowing. Show on a loanable funds market graph how the policy might affect the real interest rate. So once again, in order to answer this question, I have to draw a loanable funds market graph. Okay. If there's going to be more borrowing because the demand curve, remember, let's remind ourselves, the supply curve is saving, the demand curve is borrowing. Okay? So there's going to be more borrowing, so the demand curve is going to shift to the right. And that is going to raise the interest rate from R1 to R2. Higher interest rates make it less profitable to make investments in the economy. So number 7, we're going to see investment spending decrease. Okay? Why is that? Well, this is something you just have to memorize or remember or see if this makes sense. When a business wants to make investment, remember, that is the purchase of equipment. Okay? That's what investment is. When they purchase that equipment, they borrow money to do so. And so if interest rates rise, it costs more to borrow that money, and so their purchase of equipment would decrease. And so that is why investment spending will decrease. Now, if investment decreases, that means our aggregate demand is not going to increase as much as it would had interest rates not increased. And so we would say that the higher interest rates hinder our fiscal policy action. So aggregate demand will not increase as much as we thought it would. All right, so hopefully that helped. If any of that didn't make sense, please let me know, and I will further explain so that you can do well on your test. Thanks.